Welcome back, viewers, to the April 2015 episode of Environmental History Worth Reading. I'm Sean Courage, one of the editors here at niche-canada.org, and I'm joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I'm the niche social media editor.
And Jessica is our eyes on the internet for the network in Canadian history and environment. Every month, she collects some of the best writing, video, and audio that she can find on the internet. Stuff that's usually shared on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, or Google+. And Jessica's brought us another impressive list of 5 interesting things that she's found online. The first of which kind of picks up on a theme that we've discussed in a couple of past episodes about the memory of essentially industrial landscapes.
Yeah, so in this article, the author begins by talking about 2 monuments that were built to honor miners killed in a coal dust explosion in 2010. And she describes the monuments and how one of them reads, "God bless coal." It's a very celebratory type of monument. And in the article, she argues that this kind of celebration of this past is unhealthy. And she talks about how these communities that are moving into post-industrial economies, old steel towns, old coal mining towns, are hanging on to this kind of nostalgia that makes it difficult for them to move on. And in the article, she talks a lot about the environmental histories of some of these communities and the way that these industries affected the environment and the people's health negatively. And I just thought it was another excellent article to add to what a lot of the articles we've talked about in prior months, particularly the article by Mike Mito and Kaylee Bradley on activehistory.ca about the Sudbury Superstack.
Yeah, this complicated history of nostalgia and memory and commemoration of industrial landscapes. It's a really interesting theme, and obviously it continues to catch attention. Over at the Washington Post, Jonathan Adler has been scouring high school history textbooks.
Yeah, I enjoyed this article. So he sat down with his daughter's textbook one evening, started glancing through the pages on the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. And he talks about how he expected to disagree with some of the ways that the information was presented, but he didn't expect to find blatant factual errors. So he lists the errors that he found in just the few pages that he was looking at. And I just thought it was really interesting, kind of troubling as well, and important because a lot of people will only encounter environmental history or other histories through textbooks. So when they're factually incorrect, that's rather troublesome.
Right. On the one hand, at the university level, many students who come into environmental history courses are being exposed to environmental history for the first time. But as it's integrated in high school textbooks, there is a question about quality standards, I suppose.
Yeah.
We've got a podcast featured this month called Historically Thinking, Conversations about Historical Knowledge and How We Achieve It. And this is a focus on environmental history.
Yes, so Al Zambone from Augustana College hosts this podcast, and he had a conversation with Brian Leach, and Brian Leach goes through the historiography, the history of the development of the field of environmental history. He starts off with what he calls the 3 original areas, which he considers the material, environmental history, cultural, and political. And then he branches out into discussing the way that the field became more complicated with disaster histories, climate history, the history of disease. I found it to be an enjoyable podcast, and one that's probably helpful for people who are looking for an overview, perhaps students in undergrad classes or even people beginning a comprehensive exam field.
Yeah, he frames this as introductions to the various subfields of history. I'm just going to play a little bit so that viewers can hear what the podcast sounds like.
Sure.
It's got nice music.
Welcome to Historically Thinking, a program devoted to all kinds of
As you know,
historical
I
to the
greatly
ways that we
admire
achieve it.
high-quality podcasts.
I'm your host, Al Zambone, of the Department of History at Augustana College.
So this is, it's a really high-quality podcast. It sounds fantastic, and it's a great. This episode in particular is a great introduction to environmental history. I could see this being very useful for undergraduate and graduate students. Dolly Jorgensen brings our fourth pick this month on her blog about the return of native Nordic fauna. We're looking at beaver.
Yes. So I always enjoy Dolly's blog, and in this post she discusses the fluctuation in the cost of beavers purchased for reintroduction in Sweden in the 1920s through the 1950s, I believe. And it's just really interesting. She discusses the different political issues that affected the price of the beavers, such as the German occupation of Norway, and that it was just an ongoing struggle to set the price for them. And she concludes with a really good wrap up, and she says that this whole episode should remind us that, firstly, animals for conservation projects are commodities that are bought and sold, that somebody is making a profit off of these animals, and that everything has its price. So I just thought it was an interesting part of conservation history that we don't really think about. We don't think of these wild animals being commodities necessarily. So
This one's got a great image too. I'm just showing viewers now of there's a fellow bottle feeding a baby beaver. Quite cute. And the final pick for this month is about abandoned settlements in national parks from SmithsonianMag.com.
yeah, it's a set of images of abandoned settlements that represent agriculture, mining. I believe there's a ranch, different settlements that were in these parklands before they were national parks. And the images are very interesting, as are the captions with them. And while in professional environmental history, the idea of parks as places that were peopled beforehand is well known and common these days. It's not necessarily something that the majority of the public think about when they think about national parks. So I thought it was a good way of publicizing that fact to the general public.
And it highlights other kinds of inhabitation of national parks. I think environmental historians have focused on indigenous settlements in national parks, the settlements of rural settlers in national parks. But one of the images here that we're looking at is the remnants of a missile base in Everglades National Park. Perhaps the kind of things that you wouldn't imagine would be in national parks, even if you were familiar with the environmental history literature. Well, it's a fantastic set of picks that readers can go into some depth with this month on the Niche website at niche-canada.org. And once again, Jessica, thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean.